Perfect. Into today's webinar about restricting user access. Now, this is a standard feature of FileHold. We're not getting into anything that's overly complicated. We're not going to be going into anything that's an optional feature or is going to cost anything else. If you're a FileHold user, you already have access to all of this. You also, a lot of this may be reviewed to begin with, because I think it's important just to start off with covering some of our, core concepts that you might need to know, about before we get into restricting access. We should talk about users and groups. So totally review. For those of you who've used FileHold, you'll already know all of this. You need to set up your accounts. Your accounts contain the identity of an individual, usually with a unique email address that identifies who the user is. It creates an audit record of activity associated with that account. So the actions that you're doing are leading back to the audit record for that user. No practical limit to how many you can have. So you can have far more accounts than you have users. They're the first starting point. You create an account, and there's no access to FileHold as an account holder. So just having an account is not enough to give you access to FileHold. You must make that into a user, which is the evolution of an account. So when we enable an account, that's requiring a user license. So you're limited to how many users you can have based on your user licensing. An account can be made to either a full user or a limited user. So the account can be used either way. So it has the flexibility as far as that's concerned. It can be enabled, which makes them a user or an active account, or disabled, which is only the account. So every user must have an account, but not every account becomes a user, if you follow me. And you have no access to FileHold without being part of a group. So just promoting an account to a user status is not enough to give that user access into the system. They must also be a member of a group. So that leads us to our last concept of a group, which defines users with a specific role. So we're not just saying that this is a person, we're saying this is a person in this group which has a particular role that's defined. Users can be part of many groups with different roles. So this is the key part when we're talking about restricting accounts, is that we're going to use the group settings to enable what we're going to do to restrict that access. And there's no practical limit on the number of groups. So if you decide that you need 5 groups or 1,000 groups, that's totally legitimate. It all depends on your organizational needs, and I want to keep that in the forefront of our thinking. So accounts, users, and groups, and really today we're just going to be mainly dealing with the users and the groups in order to perform these restrictions. Now, access control is one of the fundamental things about FileHold. We've all seen this before. We know that FileHold controls access with the cabinet, folder, and the schema. We all know this song. We've all read from the same hymnal. Cabinet, folder, schema. User must be in access to all of those in order to have access to any of the documents. So user must be a member of all 3 in order to see a document or record. We can't bypass that. The group role will determine the level of access a user has to the cabinet or folder. Now, I'm saying cabinet folder, not schema, because schema is either you can see it or you can't. The cabinet and folder, where we actually look at the user role to define what their level of access is going to be. If a user is a member of multiple groups with access, their highest level of permission will apply. So if you're read-only in one area, and if you're a document publisher in another area, that's fine. But if you're a member of 2 different groups, and both those groups are part of the same cabinet, folder, and schema, you'll be a document editor within that because that's your highest role. And then finally, as a best practice, it is recommended to add groups and not users to cabinets, folders, and schemas. Just a best practice piece of advice, always a good rule of thumb. Now we want to talk about the difference between access or restriction. So we're really talking about 2 different ideas here, and that's where we're going to get into the meat of this here. So if a user cannot see a cabinet, folder, or schema, the documents related to those objects do not appear. The content is entirely hidden. And I'm saying content because that could be a document, that could be a record, that could be an offline document. No matter what, it's totally hidden. It's like it doesn't exist within the system. Access is binary. Either user can or cannot see the documents. So we're saying that if you can access it, there you go, you can see it. If you can't access it, you have nothing into there. A restriction, on the other hand, allows the user to see the contents of the library, but with control over what they can do. So we're expressing some level of control over that. So access is different from restriction. And almost every user group is offering some level of restriction onto a user's account. The only role that doesn't is a system administrator, which has unrestricted access to all aspects of FileHold. Restriction is enforced with the group role or with specific restrictions in the group. And there's a subtle distinction there, and that's what we're going to get into now. So let's go ahead and dive into FileHold. So I'm just going to open my desktop application over here. We can see I've got some structure set up for myself, and I'm just going to do a quick refresh because, it's been a while since I've used this. We've been sort of in standby. Let's just go ahead and do a refresh as I hit each one of these pages. So here we can see what I've created for today is a restricted access demo. Then I created a single drawer into here called demo files, and I've got 3 use cases here. So I've got in my first use case, I've got an area where I don't want the user to be able to print from it. I've got a second area where I don't want somebody able to download the document, and I've got a third area where I don't want them to be able to access the document. Now I've got the same document in each one of these. And the reason I've done that is because I want to show you the difference in the user experience as we're going through these. Now, it's very important to point out, I'm logged in as myself right now. I'm a system administrator, so you can't restrict my access to these in any way because I have an unrestricted access to all documents in the system. So if I want to open this document up in my viewer, I can absolutely do that at any time. So I can load my viewer in the background, there it is, and I can look at this document as much as I want to because I have that freedom to be able to do it. All right, let's close that out. And now let's take a look at what I've got built into the settings over here. So I'm going to step over to my web client where I'm logged in again as Chris. And again, I'm going to do a quick refresh because let's make sure I'm still logged in. And let's start off with our users over here. So I've created a user account for us today called a restricted user. So we have a single user account. It's a full user. So it's someone who might be able to add or edit documents into the system depending on their role. And it's enabled. So the account is enabled. So therefore, this is a user that we're looking at. So we need to apply this user to a particular area of the system. So we're going to go over and take a look at our groups. I've built 3 groups for us today. Our first group where they cannot download, our second group where they cannot print, and our third group which has total restriction. And then I've added our user into each of these. What's important is that the cannot print and total restriction are document publishers, whereas the cannot download is a read-only user. So again, I'm using those roles in order to help understand what we're going to do for restricting our users. All right. Before I go too far into that, let's take a pause and I'm going to jump over and take a look at our group settings because I always like talking about our roles within. So let's go to add group. It's always the easiest way to get into this. And we're going to just make ourselves a dummy name over here. So we're going to do with an underscore. So we're going to call this one restricted demo, and we're going to call this sample, just so we've got something that we're going to save. We can give a description for this for demo only. And now we can define a role for this. So those of you, if you've used FileHold in the admin section, you've seen this before. We've got our triangle shape here of the different roles that we have in the system, starting with read-only and extending all the way to system administration. What I want to point out is down here is our restrictions. So there are restrictions that we can put onto these accounts. If I make this, for example, a system administrator, I only have 2 restrictions onto this: the ability to disable emailing documents and the ability to disable sending to couriers. So that's a universal restriction we can put on any account. We can always take away that ability to disable emailing documents using the inbuilt function of FileHold to email the document, or disable sending to courier. Now, if I change this from system administrator and go all the way up to the other side, let's go to a read-only user, I get a different set of restrictions. I get many more options onto this. So what this means, there's specific functions that you can turn off using the group as opposed to having to use other settings within the system. So even though it's a read-only user, so someone who can download documents and they can normally open documents with the viewer, that's the function of it, here I can disable some of the other functions. And the first one over here is the ability to disable ad hoc searching. An ad hoc search is anytime you're using something like a simple search. So we'll go back over into the desktop application. If I click on search, we're in a simple search mode. So I can type a value into this, and I can hit enter, and then I can run that search coming through, and I'm showing all documents where that value comes into place. This takes that search box away, and instead what the user would have is access to public saved searches. So instead of being able to do this, they would type this, and this is the search that they would get. So they can still enter a search for a value, but what they don't get is that simple search screen. This was developed to help out to some of your users who, let's be kind about it, may need some extra assistance with learning some of the particulars about the system. They might be a bit more technologically challenged, and the search function simply gives them too many results coming back. So we've seen situations where somebody, imagine if you're working for the Acme company and somebody comes in and they type in the word Acme into the search engine. they're going to find almost every document in the system because that's going to be such a common word if you're working for the Acme company. So therefore, it makes a lot of sense to pull that back and give them only some restricted access, especially if they're a user of lesser skill. By the way, if you're a portal user, so let's go back over to here, I could make, instead of a read-only, let's say it was limited, I get the same ability to disable ad hoc searching. So you could have the portal with a bunch of built-in save searches. Those are the only tools people can access. So you can make it easier for them to access different documents within the system. Our next option down is to disable emailing of documents. Now, there's other tools that you might think about using for disabling emails. Like, for example, you could come down to your library configuration, settings general, and then under here, you could look at this and say, okay, what I really want to be able to do is restrict. So instead of being able to send as an attachment or a link, I'm going to let people send a link. So now people can send an email link out. But some other users might say, I don't want to send a link, I want to be able to send an attachment. So you might then need to come back over into your groups and build a group where you have that configured into there. So by the way, you notice I didn't save over there. I knew what I was doing. I'm just going to quickly rebuild what we had. So we're going to call this group sample, and then we're just going to make this back to limited. There we go. So we've built back what we had before. By disabling email, it means that nobody can use that email function within FileHold. So you know that when you're in an area, so let's just go ahead and click on any document into here, and I select this. Again, I'm an admin, so I've got an email button up to here, and when I click that, I can send this email attachment off as an attachment or as a link. And what this will do is turn off that button for a user within, when the user's in that group, and you have that restriction on, the email button turns off. All right, our next option over here is to disable download. This is where we no longer have the ability to take a copy from FileHold and download it locally. This is a major restriction, but oftentimes you want people to keep documents within the system. Maybe you're in an air-gapped environment and you want people to only be able to look at documents within the browser. Or, again, it's a limited group. Maybe you want to say, I don't want my people who can see the portal to get copies of the documents. So you can disable their download so they can't open documents with a native application and they can't make local copies of the documents. Now, the big warning over this is, of course, if it's a document that's not compatible with the FileHold viewer, they will not be able to look at the document. So you want to make sure you're only doing this when you're dealing with documents that people can see, such as you've got a repository of PDFs or similar image files. Well, the viewer can look at that, so we can use the FileHold viewer to access them. So again, be careful with that one, but it's certainly not a major limitation. Just understand what we're doing. Now, you might be in a situation where you say you're going to disable you're going to allow the download, but you're not going to allow them to print. So there's an option within the viewer. Let's go back into the desktop application and let's go back into our viewer. So let's open this in the viewer. And then once this is loaded, you'll see that there's a print option over here. This takes that print option away. If I right click on this option and say send to printer, I'm going to open this document up with the viewer. So if you're not dealing with a document that's viewer compatible, you shouldn't see the print option appear onto this. And that's why that's the built-in safety. So this again is giving you that set of options to be able to control that access so people aren't able to get a hard copy of that document. Now, this is where I often like to put a little asterisk beside this, because if somebody can download a local copy of the document, then there's a chance that they could simply print it using the native application. There's nothing within FileHold that can stop them from doing that. There's also nothing in FileHold that can stop them from pulling out their cell phone and taking a picture of the screen. We understand that. Sometimes it makes sense to limit people's access into the system through this so you lose that function. Other times it makes sense to allow them to do that so that they do it in FileHold and create an audit record. So if you're an administrator worrying about the security of your documents, allowing print into this means that you have an audit record of someone printing the document from FileHold. And that's often more valuable than the restriction. But again, your organization, your rules, I don't want to overstep my bounds onto that one by giving bad advice. So just remember what that disable printing will do there. And our last option on this is disable viewing. This disables the viewer. So if a user can't view the document, then it means the only thing they could do is get a local copy of it. If I turn all of these on, what am I left with? If I can't do an ad hoc search of the document, if I can't email it, if I can't download it, and I can't print or review it, what else can I do? I can see the document exists. And that's often really valuable information as well. Imagine I'm an auditor coming into the system and I want to look to see if documents exist. I am not validating the document is accurate or correct. I'm simply looking for where the document is in the system. I can have this kind of role and have access to that. With this, now I could have access to the documents and open them up with the viewer. So I can see the content, but I can't get local copies of it. So again, we're granting people some permissions into here based on what they want to do. Now, this limited role is obviously people who can't add content into the system. So we don't see that as any of the options into here. If I move to read only, it's the exact same set of options. So I have the same 5 that I had before. But once I move to a document publisher, we gain another one, which is this one right here, disable sending to courier. So the disable sending to courier means that I can turn the courier function off for that particular group. So I'm saying that although courier is something that we're using as a team, we are not granting access to this group to use courier. So this group of people who are adding documents in, they can't use courier, but this group over here that's dealing with external reviews and approvals, or they're in HR and they want to be able to send documents to other team members, we are going to allow them to be able to use courier. So again, you have that as a point of control. Once I move past document publisher, I lose the ability to restrict access to downloading, viewing, and printing documents. To put it another way, once you're a document publisher and delete, every role above that has inherent access to be able to download local copies and print the document. So that's an important detail because you might say, oh, I have this administrator and I don't want them to be able to download a document. Can't restrict them that way, not how it works. This is the settings. In fact, these are the options that we have all the way through up to and including Senior Library Administrator. Even at that level, I can disable ad hoc searches, disable emailing documents, and disable sending to courier. Once I pass that Senior Library Admin, go to System Admin, only then do I lose the ability to disable ad hoc searching. Put it another way, system administrators have inherent access to be able to send, to be able to use the ad hoc search function. In fact, that's one of the key definitions of being that level of administrator. So these are our groups and these are our restrictions that we can apply to them. So in the macro, we've got our group with our different roles here. So, if you have somebody who's an administrator or a non-administrator, the different roles, you can define it there. And then you can fine tune that even finer by saying they're a publisher, but they're a publisher who doesn't have access to courier or to email. Let's look at that practically now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a different account. So I'm going to come over to here where I've logged in as a restricted user, and I'm going to do a quick refresh. And I think that's looking a little tiny for me, so I'm just going to make that a bit bigger. There we go. So you've got our a restricted user, and you'll see that they have a very limited access to what they can see in the system. So over here, remember, we've set them to a group where they don't have access to be able to print. So if I select this if I open up this folder and select my document, when I right click on it, even if I see send to, I don't see the print option into there. So it's been taken away. If I was if I was a different role, I might have access to be able to print this document. But in this role, I do not. So that option to be able to print the document has been taken away from me, and I don't even know that it's missing. Our next one over here is don't want to download. So if we take a look at this, and again, I select my document. Now remember, we're a read-only user in this case. So because we're a read-only user, we get the red dot on front of it. I can't make any modifications to this, but if I try to get a copy, you'll see that the button's not working for me. I can't check the document out. I can't really do anything to it. And if I right-click on it, I don't get the option to send it to a local system. I had that from before, but I don't have it here. I can't open this, there's no make a local copy. All I can do is open it up in the FileHold viewer, which I still have access to. So there it is, and I can click that, and it's going to load it into the viewer and show me my document just like anything else in the system. So I can still access it, but I can't download it locally. Again, no problem. For a read-only account, this makes perfect sense. And because it's a PDF, then there's no issues there. And then finally, can't access the document. So if we select this one, we now see our document. We've got a yellow light on it because, again, we're a full user onto this in a non-read-only role. But when I select my document and right-click onto it, we don't get a lot of the same options. So here I can do notify me, I can subscribe to it. It gives me copy or move because I might be able to move this to other parts of the system. I can initiate workflow onto this if I wanted to, but what I can't do, even if I click on open in FileHold viewer, I get an insufficient permission notification because I'm not allowed to do that because of the restriction that I put onto the account. So this is why this particular user can't do anything other than see this document exists. But I could add content into this folder and then not be able to look at that content I've added in later. This is perfect if you have a temporary worker or somebody who's not going to be there, on a full-time basis. You want to give them access to FileHold to be able to add content in. You're going to show them how to do that, or maybe have them do someone's workstation with a manage import to bring something in from like SmartSoft Capture. They're just going to be processing documents, but once they're in there, they should have no business seeing the content of it. This kind of restriction works perfectly for that. So it's taking away their ability to manipulate without taking away their ability to access, because they can still see the document exists, they just can't do anything to it. And quite often, that's a very valid use case. So we talked about access with using our user groups to control the level of the group access. Now the question then is, what happens if you're a member of two different groups with different restrictions? Your highest level of permission will apply. So if I was a member of this group for the can't access the documents, let's just head back over to here. And I'm now going to go down to my folder. I can close my viewer. And I'm going to go to the can't access the documents and go into the properties for this. And I'm going to add a group into this. I'm going to add the cannot download group into this. So we're going to add that group. So now we have a read-only group with cannot download and a document publisher group with a total restriction. This is not going to give the user more permission because the read-only group has a lesser role than this document publisher group. So if I was to do this, it wouldn't suddenly grant them access to be able to do those other functions that the cannot download read-only group can do, because the higher level of group takes precedence. On the other hand, if I add this group to it, which is also a document publisher group, I will grant them that permission because that's the highest level of group with more access. So you're giving people more access into the system. By the way, even if I add myself into this group, it's not going to have any impact because I'm still a system administrator. That overrides everything. So it's always be careful when you're adding admins into this and trying to use this context, because admins will often completely ignore most of those restrictions that you're putting onto the account because of the different points of access that they can control within the system. So that's a rough overview of how to deal with restrictions within FileHold and be able to control people's access within to the system. Now, as I say, this is something that you currently have. If you're an Active Directory user, of course, you'll be bringing over your proxy groups into FileHold. So again, we all know what those look like. If you're in your users list over here, you'll see some of them that are, in this case, I don't have Active Directory, so I only have local users. I don't have all locally managed. I don't have any domain groups. I don't have any domain users. And so therefore, I'm not seeing any difference between that as far as experience goes. But if you have them, your domain group would then be associated with a FileHold group where those restrictions would then come into play. So it's still, this system still works very well if you have any of those other factors to put into mind, like Active Directory or Azure Active Directory still works for those.